This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to gain and had such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come aboard to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
now these people are in very high positions, yeah.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 230. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we have a very good SJ topic, I think, queued up. Wouldn't you agree, Khalid?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
I was,
this is,
really interested in this one. This one, really, hit close to home for me, I have to say.
Me too, in a lot of ways.
And this actually kind of touches on a lot of,
we'll get into it.
Yeah.
But, not our idea, we have to say, because we were joined.
No, it was not.
With an old comrade from the internet, Reid, a.k.a. formerly Seriations. Some of you may know from Twitter/X, but not anymore.
Oh, yeah, you're
RIP,
off Twitter now,
literally.
right? Yeah.
That's right. Reid, are you there?
Yeah, are you enjoying that? Being away from...
It's good living back in the real world.
Yeah.
I benefited from Twitter in a lot of ways, got to know a lot of cool people, but it had outlived its usefulness for me.
Yeah, I constantly want to get off of it, but then
Yeah.
I feel like, should I still be on it for the podcast, But it just sucks. I hate it so much. Yeah.
I would say, we're still there, but kind of there's a little quiet quitting going on, I think. Whatever happened there the last, for about a decade is no longer happening there, I think. It's just the Elon slop factory now. But
it's hard to take joy in posting with whatever's going on in the background is half the time.
Yeah,
the most deranged, awful excuses for humanity.
Right. So you made the wise choice to go underground, but we've caught a hold of you. You actually reached out to us after a period of occultation and brought us this idea for an episode, to which I think I pretty much immediately said yes, because even though I didn't know, when I started really looking into it, I realized how little I knew about this topic we're going to get into today, Biosphere 2.
I have to admit, I had never heard of this before.
Really?
Yeah, I had heard of the movie Biodome, as I was saying. When you first noticed it, I was like, do you mean Biodome? Because I remember, my friends, in elementary school thinking that was, a hilarious movie. But I had never heard of, the actual, experiment or, whatever of Biosphere 2. And I really feel like I should have, because this is, right up my alley.
It
this
is.
is, everything... I was borderline triggered reading some of this because I've known so many John Allens in my life. He really is kind of just every theater director in a way. He's also he's a freak in a unique sense, but also not at all unique. He's really just every theater person.
Well, that for one, I had no idea.
Theater person.
I had no idea that was an aspect of the story. There was a theater component to the Biosphere 2 story, and in fact, I'm a little surprised, actually, Khalid, that you hadn't at least heard of it recently, because the only thing that stuck in my mind, besides the Pauly Shore, Stephen Baldwin 1996 vehicle, Biodome, which I did see and love as a child, and I rewatched for this episode, unfortunately. Maybe he'll talk a little bit about that film later. But the other thing that popped in the last maybe 5 to 7 years was, I remember, reading about this Trump's bad boy, Stephen K. Bannon, and reading a bunch of, New York Times profiles about him. And, I think we've discussed in the show the bizarre Forrest Gump maneuvers of Stephen K. Bannon's career. I think probably very early on, we talked about like him being in business with Brock Pierce and taking over like IGE and like World of Warcraft gold mining like scam companies in the 2000s when he was working for Goldman Sachs. But then I remember reading a profile and I saw Stephen K. Bannon was put in charge for a little while of the Biosphere 2 project in the 1990s. And I was like, wait a minute. Like the fucking thing that Biodome was based on, Stephen Bannon was running that for a while. And that always just like stuck in my mind of like, okay, what the fuck? Like there's got to be something weird going on there. But then never really heard much more about it and didn't really think too much about like the Biosphere 2 or what was behind that whole project until Reid, you came to us with this. And whoo boy, like there is a lot going on with Biosphere 2. And I guess since you brought it to us, Reid, like how did you stumble across this and what specifically was it about the Biosphere 2 story that made you be like, I got to go on SJ and talk about this shit?
So I was first aware of it when I was growing up in the 90s. I think the experiment proper was from 91 and 93, so it was a little bit before my time, but it was definitely something that I was very much aware of as a kid who was really into science, going to space camp, and really paying attention to a lot of the kind of science media building hype for the NASA Mars missions with all the various rovers and, supposed to be, as we might get into later on, sort of like a multi-step sort of fulfillment of the Werner von Braun plan. You
oh yeah,
crash the space station is a stepping stone to the moon. Moon is a stepping stone to colonies on the moon. That's a stepping stone to colonizing Mars.
Ruled by the Elons, etc.
Yeah,
exactly. Ruled by the Elons as we are now. So I just remember it being kind of like an iconic thing in pop culture. I think it was parodied in a lot of cartoons. They just sort of have like a memory of that. But it was definitely something that was cool, interesting, groundbreaking, and we'll talk about some of the media at the time that kind of fell credulously for its branding. And then I think it was like 2 years ago when I was just looking into, I heard that Stephen Bannon had some role because I'd read some article, all the recent media, like from the 2010s on, that mentions Biosphere 2, it almost exclusively focuses, Dimitri, kind of like you were talking about, on Bannon's role. And they never really get into what exactly he did or why he was called in by billionaire Ed Bass to take over. So I was just kind of wondering, like, well, okay, if Steve Bannon got involved as sort of a crisis management and hostile takeover guy, what the hell was going on before? Must be something interesting. And I think the first real digging I did into this was just following, this is a great way to start if anybody's interested in doing research of this kind of their own. Just check through the Wikipedia footnotes and you'll find a couple, if it's a well-cited article, 500, 600-page books that nobody's bothered to actually read through. And so going through the Lawrence Vese book, The Communal Experience, and reading a lot more about the actual background with John P. Allen's first cult, I realized, okay, there's a much stranger story that goes a lot deeper, and the Bannon angle is not where anything begins. That's maybe where the strangeness just starts to get covered up.
Yeah, you recommended this book by Vese, which might be a little bit like difficult for people to find a connection to this because, the whole everyone in the group, everyone in the sort of theater of all possibilities, which was sort of the precursor to the Biosphere 2 project, is referred to by pseudonyms, because it's like the sort of ethnographic thing. But yeah, this is definitely a great account of it. Vese previously wrote The Emergence of the American University, which is another like sort of similar. He has a very peculiar type of style to him, and like he definitely has a clear point of view. But he's like the perfect person to write this like study of John Allen's group, like his
right.
Yeah,
because he's not a total babe in the woods when it comes to
not.
certain American New Age traditions, let's say. Because he grew up, I think he ended up being a UC Santa Cruz professor, right? And he grew up, I think, in California. And his parents were pretty into, and here it is again, like theosophy adjacent stuff in California. And I forget if he just like visited or like lived in like a sort of like theosophist or theosophist adjacent kind of commune, or like he was definitely like very aware of it growing up and had some like passing familiarity with it. So when he goes to hang out at this place, Synergia Ranch, and meets this, leader who he calls Ezra, but who's actually John Allen, he spots some things that maybe some other people would miss in terms of his influences, which, you know, he gets into like pretty deeply. And I think he really like nails like this group like back. And also he goes and lives with them for like 6 weeks, I think, right? Yeah. He does a real like ethnographic immersion field work kind of thing.
Yeah,
and
he's been an observer. That's
right. As an observer, though it's at times he felt like weird, kind of like emotional, like he felt like an entanglement, like he was like letting the group down, and like, you know, and then like he was mad at himself for like why do I feel that way? Like I think these people are sus, you know, or this leader is sus, but like he's still exerting a kind of like his riz is kind of exerting some kind of force on me, kind of thing. And it, like he's pretty like self-reflective and like has his head on straight, but also is kind of familiar with a little more of the woo-woo mystical kind of things. And yeah, so he's there for a while, and I think he like paints a pretty vivid and accurate portrait, and you know, I would say like kind of sees through some of the magic that's going on with this group, which is not something you can say about all of the forms of media that have been made about this group, right? I think the other film that I watched in preparation for this, and might be like a lot of other people's like only exposure to the Biosphere 2 story over the last decade, besides Bannon articles, is the, I think 2020, interesting year for it, a documentary called Spaceship Earth, which I think, you know, premiered to like pretty rave, you know, reviews. I think it's Sundance in 2020. So this is like a coincidental kind of COVID movie, I realized, like, because it's about people locked inside, like basically isolated inside of like an enclosed space for a really long period of time, like basically on lockdown. And it came out, you know, Netflix rolled it out when we were all in lockdown, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. I didn't see it at the time, so I don't know if like any marketing campaigns kind of leaned into that, you know? Isn't this interesting and relevant? You know, kind of like the Squid Game. Anyways, that documentary, my God, talk about like Phil Oakes documentary syndrome. You know what I'm saying, Khalid? Like, remember, I think we talked in past episodes about hagiographic, like boomery, like music documentaries, especially from the 2000s. But I guess now we have to say, like, even up to this day, that are like, especially talking about the fucking 60s. I get so triggered now.
Did you watch this Spaceship Earth, this documentary about Biosphere 2?
No, I didn't get a chance.
Oh my, well, it's good that you didn't, because it was like the biggest like waste of time. It sucks so much. Like, and the thing is that you could tell that like there was a story there that like would have created a great documentary.
Yeah.
But like if they basically only interviewed like all the people who like still had like a positive attitude about the whole thing, and basically like we're still enthralled to John Allen. That was the impression that I got.
And
it
John
ended up
Allen
being
himself.
Like, yeah, and it ended up being hugely like misrepresentative and like incredibly boring. A big thing about this was that, like, you're talking about Steve Bannon, Dimitri, like a big aspect of this was that kind of Steve Bannon is sort of represented as like this evil, like, you know, finance guy who came in and destroyed like the true spirit of Biosphere 2. It's like, well, they're all like kind of from the same world in a way. Like Steve Bannon is like an occultist. Like he loves like transcendental meditation. He loves like Evola. Like he's into all of that like weird shit. Like he really, like, I feel like there's a reason why he would gravitate to that. Because it was from that same kind of soup that he was interested in, but like none of that was even like brought up at all. It just
or not even to mention the occult influence on the group itself, which I think we will get into, is literally never mentioned in the entire documentary. Like it's the biggest new age fucking whitewash of like sus California ideology, like neo occult hippies that are doing some like weird neo theosophy, Gurdjieffian shit. The G word is not brought up once in this documentary because this guy, John Allen, the leader, they, of course, you know, I could tell early on, they have a lot of great 16 millimeter footage that, you know, was like 4K, you know, remastered and everything, that one of the women who were like the main figures in this group shot back in the 60s in San Francisco, which is where this group first kind of sprang into action. And I could just tell, like, with her narration over it, this kind of bland, like, we were just, you know, trying anything. It was the 60s. It was, you know, we just all, like, everyone has the most unbelievable fucking anecdote of how they met John Allen that makes, like, no sense. But I could just tell that, like, oh, this is, like, a very access-dependent documentary. Like they have to pursue a certain
exactly.
line with all these people, or they're not going to cooperate with them or give them all this cool B-roll showing all their exploits. So like you kind of, that's a big thing in documentary filmmaking, especially when we're dealing with like these kind of like weird charismatic figure that, you know, people have been accused of being a cult over the years. They can be very, very protective over their media image. And once I saw John Allen himself at like age 90 pop up in it, in like a, you know, this very like sympathetic portrait, you know, and he's being interviewed and everything, and just talking like it really in these like kind of vague like TED Talky like Silicon Valley with like a little bit of hippie dash of hippiness kind of thing about like all of his exploits. It was like, oh no, they have to toe the line or else like all these people are going to walk and they're going to quote unquote not have a movie. When, you know what, like I know the people who made Netflix documentaries, like you need to have like the fucking 4K, like beautiful portrait, like talking head interviews with the real people. And then it's all emotionally manipulative and they tell you their little anecdotes. But like, maybe we should go back to doing documentaries where like you just make a documentary and accuse people of stuff, like, and use archive footage and like don't fucking have to interview them, because like you're giving up, like they gave up so much, like in terms of the story, to just like kiss these people's asses and kind of rehabilitate this project, which
they kind of like didn't even get into like how awful it was inside the biosphere, because like the whole time like you go through like this interminable sequence where they're like talking about how they built a boat, the Heraclitus, which is like such a like a normie, like a little fixation for people to get into, like, oh wow, everything is it was such a 60s like boomer thing to name their boat the Heraclitus, like everything's flux, everything's changed. So we had to hear about that for like 30 minutes, and then like we never even theater. Like you're like, okay, well here comes the meat of the documentary where obviously they're gonna go insane from being in this biosphere, but you didn't even really get into like how they were all starving,
suffocating.
Like, the main baddie of like the ending of the documentary was the media, because the media like made it seem like they were, you know,
cheating,
like they were cheating, and like that's not really what it was all about or whatever. And like sure, there was like a media firestorm around it, and maybe like its stated purpose was somewhat distorted. However, like the whole thing itself was insane, and like would have been much more interesting to explore like its actual genesis rather than tell us other thing about how like, oh, the big bad media like, you know, misjudged them, and then the evil Steve Bannon came in, and we all know he's bad because of Drumpf, etc.
That's one of the things that really kind of drew me to this story as well, because as soon as I started digging into it, just like doing a very cursory newspapers.com search, you find out there is no shortage of things that an adversarial documentary could accuse John Paul Allen of having done, because he's been very credibly accused of sexual abuse, which we will get into later on, something that there's no even controversy section on his Wikipedia page. Like they have done an incredible job despite contemporaneous critical reporting that both in the years leading up to the, you know, formation and opening of Biosphere 2 and then afterwards, very critical media talking about all the ways that it was a scam, it was junk science, you know, there was abuse involved of multiple kinds. All that's gone now. And as of 2016, the Institute of Ecotechnics, which is one of the parent organizations that Alan runs, is hosting psychedelic psychology, psychotherapy conferences in 2016.
Oh my God.
Such luminaries of the establishment as ex-CIA officer Valerie Plame. You're talking about the virtues.
Oh my God. Yep.
Totally
right. I didn't realize they were getting into psychedelics, because the documentary, you know, definitely tries to emphasize early on in their trippy Haight-Ashbury days that, you know, they didn't, drugs, that wasn't their trip, man. They were all about doing experimental theater. Like, you know, and I mean, from the other things I read about them, it does seem like back in the peak hippie days, they were not like drug heads, you know, basically. But now I guess that it's all been kind of laundered by Silicon Valley, and it's both spiritual and capitalistic.
Like that was, I also like picked up on that they were like, oh, you know, and that was a theme, like, and that comes through in Vasey's book as well, like that they were very like project oriented. This is also kind of like a theater-based ethos. Like they want, like the most important thing was like completing stuff. Like that was their, like, you know, not just like wasting their time and like I get a lot of like communes and intentional communities or whatever in the 60s dissolved like based on people's like unwillingness to do anything, which probably had a little bit to do with the fact that they were just constantly taking drugs. But it also does seem like later on, like for instance, like the physician who was in Biosphere 2, like his use of drugs is described as like, you know, unbelievable, like how much like weed he would smoke. Like they're, like I think that was something that was a thing, like it maybe a part of like a resistance to like sort of the unproductivity of like other groups that were like very that were more aggressively into drugs. But I think to say they didn't do drugs is certainly like misleading too.
Well,
but a
I mean,
broader
he also
thing-
wasn't part of like the core group of them. He was a UCLA nutritionist and like professor.
Yeah, he did come in later on, but
Yeah.
I'd also think that like in general, it's like misleading. And I also would say that like more broadly, like an element of like the coverage of this that sort of stick, or like the main theme that I see is this, which kind of feeds into the whole thing of theater and kind of in a way to what you're talking about, is this sort of dichotomy of like art and science. And this idea of like, woo woo and like, junk science and like real science. And like there's constantly like these sort of maneuvers and shifts. Like this is kind of what happens when Steve Bannon takes over, where it's like, or when later on Columbia like eventually comes and like takes over Biosphere 2, right? And it becomes like an official laboratory of Columbia University. There's always this like pivoting maneuver where it's like, oh, okay, well now we're getting back to real science, away from the sort of experimental stuff that like they were doing before that wasn't quote unquote like really scientific. And I think that like that is like a sort of what's the way to say it, like a discursive maneuver that's designed to create this aura of legitimacy around like the enterprise of science, sort of by contrast with disavowing actually what's totally part of itself. Like none of this would even exist if it hadn't been for like they're working with these original like Biospherian, basically a cult. But now, we're able to sort of jettison that and then also like sort of disavow it and create this, cast or this impression of like legitimacy for ourselves. Like it's able to constantly morph. And like, as like people sort of are like, wait a minute, like, who is this guy? Like, what? Like, why is he this weird guru? Like, why? Like, do all the people who have authority just like random kids who lived on this one compound in New Mexico for a couple of years? Like, why are they in charge of everything? Like, over like the quote unquote experts. But really, like, that sort of distinction is in a way, in and of itself, like performative. And it like allows like the core of it to be preserved while creating the impression that like, these undesirable things, they've served their purpose so they can be discarded. But without them, like none of this would really exist. And so I feel like that's something that I see constantly is like moving across, like as I've like read a couple of books about this now and like seeing that documentary, it's always moving across this line between like sort of play and the real science. And it kind of feeds into the stuff we talked about before about this kind of cult around science itself as an idea, or like a reified, objectified thing.
Absolutely. And the theatricality you were hinting at earlier is definitely a feature of how both the original cult, Synergia Ranch, and Biosphere 2 were marketed both to the public and to the scientific partner investors like NASA, University of Arizona, Columbia, and even just at the level, without even questioning what's the boundary between like quote unquote real science and, junk science, call it as you were very well putting it well. The question of just, the old magician's trick of where is your attention looking at any one time is all this, like one of the things that gets talked about in some of the readings I've done was the fact that a lot of the different plant and animal species and biome density inside Biosphere, that they were doing this thing called like species packing. Part of that was just so that it would look good, right? Whereas maybe the actual object of the experiment was a simple isolation experiment, just in a different environment, like it had been done in, in Antarctica by the Navy and, plenty of previous research. So what's stage setting and what's the actual object of the, the performance is up for grabs.
Right. Yes. Like this, there's this whole thing like, okay, we're going to get rid of like these disreputable people, and then we'll just keep the institution of Biosphere to itself. But all like and you're talking about this now, like how, I was thinking, of course, like once I started looking at this topic, what immediately came to my mind is like sort of something that Dimitri and I have like talked about like endlessly, which is like the idea of like, this whole, like, we're going to build these sort of climate safe, like, we're going to colonize Mars, to create these sort of enclosures that, will allow us to live on another planet. And this is basically the premise of, we should probably explain like what this project is for people who don't know, as I didn't originally, but like, that was kind of the idea behind Biosphere 2, like this weird cult of people who were also like a theater company decided that they were going to create like a sort of hermetically sealed ecosystem across multiple different biomes that would kind of be a model for for how people could live in outer space in something similar to Biosphere 2. And it's called Biosphere 2 because it's like a sort of model of our biosphere, which is like the entire Earth, right? So that's why there's no Biosphere 1. Well, there is,
Earth
we are
is
currently in
Biosphere
Biosphere 1, right? Yeah,
Right.
there's no Project Biosphere. But anyway, yeah, so that's the idea. But yeah, like, so this whole like project that they're trying to do, like it did remind me like of what we've talked about in the past, where it's like, they're saying they're going to create these environments in outer space, but is that really for people to live in like on Earth once the climate here becomes so like inhospitable?
I'm
is
actually
this really a fantasy of colonizing Mars? I definitely thought of that because it's something that we've mentioned multiple times. But without that kind of vision of these sort of, magical or, experimental or sort of theatrical personalities who are like, quote unquote, not serious or can be designated as such at the drop of a hat, that whole, like, there's no sort of cover for that thing. There's no sort of auspice under which that can happen. And then once, they no longer are useful, they can be jettisoned, say like, okay, well, now we're coming in, now we're making this serious, but it's already been sort of accepted. It's already an existent thing. And we now have to accept that, oh, well, this is the new management. The new boss is in, and it's no longer this weird program to create sort of this, Biosphere 2 based on this bizarre, I hate to use the Alex Jones terminology, but based on like the way they talk, it really is like a Gaia religion, like
literally. That's how they described it in the 70s. Yeah,
exactly.
Mark Nelson will like mention like we need to heal our relationship with Gaia, and like stuff like that. They were definitely about the Gaia religion in some respects. And that's
all those
crazy.
elements are still baked into it, like they are inextricable from it. But there's a sort of pretense that they can be extricated and that they have been, and that now, and they can just do that maneuver endlessly by sort of shuffling people around and discoursing it in a different way.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, though, like my attention definitely was, though I think the corporate suits, Ed Bass, most of all, are very interesting. We should like get into their involvement with it. Like, while they are still the ones in control of like the biosphere sort of structure today, or at least they might, I forget if they sold it off now or like spun it off to University of Arizona, but they ended up in control of it and kind of kicked out like the John Allen team. But it really was like the John Allen team that conceived of this entire idea to begin with. So you're right, just because like they're gone, like this was their brainchild. And I was frankly like shocked when I started looking into this, because we brought up that thing so many times with Elon Musk, talking about his Mars colonies, that it seems like nobody brings up Biosphere 2 as like an example of, hey, we tried to do an experiment, even though that was explicitly like the motivation for building the Biosphere 2. Like that was one of the primary motivations, was a model for building Mars colonies in the future. In one article I saw, they were running around in 1991 saying that they could probably, the booklet from the 80s that John Allen and Mark Nelson wrote, I think called Space Biospheres, confidently assured us that the first Mars colony could be established by 1995. So they're just like popping off about this shit. But, we had sort of darkly surmised, like, what if this is about, because when you step back and think about it, like, why would you go to this like faraway planet that we can't even really get to yet, with like a really thin atmosphere that gets irradiated as fuck and is really cold and doesn't have any breathable air? Like, it just seems like for the smartest man in the world, Elon Musk, and all these geniuses at Synergia Ranch and all the people around them, like, you think that would be thrown out right away as like, oh, that like, no, obviously Earth is like, sure, maybe in the future we want to be able to get off the planet, and like that's a nice thing. But like the idea that any planet in our solar system is a better candidate to live on than this one is ridiculous, right? So then why are you doing this? There has to be some kind of logic, right? Because it's not immediate profit. This is like a long-term R&D kind of thing. And I think the most logical thing would be, if anything happens to our climate and we can't leave, you could build biospheres. and this was maybe an attempt to see what would happen if you did that. And of course, we might discuss this kind of down the road, because like the documentary definitely doesn't get into it, but also like the psychological aspect of all of this, which is definitely something like the media was ambiently interested in almost a kind of like proto-reality TV kind of way.
Yeah.
Like this is even maybe Real World was like just coming out, but I don't think so in 91. I think maybe it was. Maybe it was like just starting. But like Big Brother, Survivor, shows like that hadn't really like taken off yet. But people were kind of like really interested in like, are these 8 people going to go like crazy and just like rip each other apart? You know, are they going to like have interpersonal blah blah blah, you know? And they all kind of like, the impression I got from the whole Biosphere team was like they were really de-emphasizing that, because all these people were such like chipper believers, and they're like Biospherians, and they're like designer spacesuits that were made for them that look like fucking Heaven's Gate uniforms a little bit. But like that was kind of like always de-emphasized. But then I definitely saw some sources that were saying, maybe it was quoting some of the Biospherians, that mentioned at various points that they felt like, you know, they were kind of being like played with, you know, almost in like, I don't know, like a Stanford prison experiment kind of vibe, or a theater game, you know?
They absolutely were. Like, did you read like this book? You said you read a little bit of it, the Dreaming the Biosphere by Rebecca Reeder. You probably have read this, Reid, right?
I skimmed it when I was first looking into this 2 years ago, but
yeah. It's pretty good. It's definitely more sympathetic than Vasey's account, but it definitely does like incorporate much more. Like if people are encountering this through the documentary, this really like you know, is a much more like accurate and sort of balanced depiction, even though she does have like some sympathy for some of these people. Like she talks about, you know, Dr. Ray Walford, we talked about, who was like, you know, this sort of incredible consumer of marijuana, you know, and it kind of does allude to this documentary, but like not in depth at all. He was like kind of fixated with this idea that he was going to live to be 120 years old. And he had done these, this is again, another theme that kind of ties us into like the current transhumanist obsessions. Like he, you know, was really into like human longevity and like extending his life and immortality, right? So he had this idea of like the 120-year diet, like, and he wrote these books like Maximum Lifespan and things like that. So, you know, in this book, Rebecca Reeder says, like, now, you know, that he was in the biosphere, this was the ideal research opportunity. He says, I think if there had been any other nutritionist or physician, they would have freaked out and said, we're starving. But I knew we were actually on a program of health enhancement, the already lean Roy said. He called the Biospherian food regime a healthy starvation diet, low in calories, but high in nutrients from all the ultra-fresh produce. Tracking the Biospherians' blood chemistry, he found that they actually were getting healthier according to the numbers. Everyone's blood pressure and cholesterol both dropped, just as it happened in Roy's lab mice. So, yeah, that's where you kind of see, like, okay, so she's saying, like, oh, hey, it worked, but, like, he was experimenting on them. Like, he was running a human trial of his mouse longevity study on his fellow Biospherians in this dome.
And they kind of like gloss over that a little bit in the documentary, but mostly by talking about how they all started like losing tons of weight and were looking like skeletal.
They don't mention them starving at all. They say that they ran out of oxygen, which they did, and they had to pump in oxygen. But yeah,
they mentioned that a lot of their crops either failed or they had to switch to like growing beets and eating everything beetroot, this and that, because like it was the most productive crop in the winter and stuff like that. And one person mentioned like, oh yeah, like Roy had this like amazing revolutionary diet that he like swore by, and he had us all try it out. And they sounded kind of like, oh yeah, we all just like went along with it. And also maybe they didn't have any other food to eat, so they like had no. It was almost constructed in such a way that like they had to follow his insane experimental diet. But I think they all ended up, like just eating like beetroots and stuff like that, and just losing. Even Walford himself, like, because he's kind of fond of like posing, like filming himself posing in a Speedo. He's like a very ripped like guy in his early 60s.
Well, he's dead, when he goes in there.
But then by the
he
end,
was the one who actually died the earliest.
He got
ironically,
Lou
he's
Gehrig's
dead now.
disease,
Yeah.
I think.
So it wasn't, wasn't his diet's fault, I guess. I don't know.
I guess, yeah. But like you do see footage that he was taking himself flexing like later when they're maybe like a year into the Biosphere experiment, and he's like lost a ton of weight and muscle mass and looks like skeletal. Like he doesn't look healthy at all. And I don't think it was healthy, like for definitely not under those conditions for everybody. So it was kind of like this experiment. And given that they broke the rules, as even the documentary points out, that there are a couple times where like the stated rules of like not bringing in any, outside stuff and like only using air that was like generated or recycled inside the biosphere. They broke those rules with like when they felt they had to a number of times, which like, some of these haters in the media, they like wouldn't let go and like blah, blah, blah. But in other cases, they kind of like let these people like suffer a lot and like in a way of, in a kind of like, let's see what happens kind of way. Like that's just the vibe I got. So yeah, I mean, there's more dimensions to this than I think like the group itself was definitely presenting when they rolled out, in the early 90s with like this like amazing, next level thing that was going to save the human race. It was simultaneously kind of utopian, but also apocalyptic, right? Because like it operated on this like public feeling that one, like that we have all this new like rockin' technology and all these cool scientists that are hippies and like open, their minds are open, blah, blah, blah. And, we can use all our like space age, whatever technology to get ourselves out of any ecological crisis and find a way to overcome climate change, et cetera, by doing these experiments. On the other hand, it almost presupposes that it might be too late for like the Earth, and thus we need to build like a lifeboat, or like a Noah's Ark that people can like the Soviets thought about the planet Photon, that just needed to shoot off some spaceships and then land on a nearby planet because like we're all about to be destroyed. So it's got these two things kind of going on at the same, these two both kind of appealing in different ways, kind of currents like running through it that I think help make it like a sensation when it launches. But
they like explicitly said, one of the things like jumped out at me from this same book by Reader was that like this whole idea of like the naturalist trance. This reminded me so much of like, again, all these people like John Allen. I feel like in my reading of him, again, there's other interpretations people could have. My reading of him is that he's fundamentally a theater person, fundamentally has the personality type of theater director, which is like a megalomaniac who like is really caught up like in his own brilliance or his own idea of his own brilliance. And there's this one passage here where like they're talking about like John Allen's conception for Biosphere 2, and he makes these continual references to this thing called the naturalist trance, which is a concept from this biologist E.O. Wilson, I guess. So it's a state in which, an able-minded observer, it becomes basically absorbed into union with their environment. This is what Allen says. In this particular state of attention, the scientific observer can begin to take in the totality of life events occurring around him and receive insights into its mechanisms and patterns. In such a trance, Allen believed, intelligent humans could intuitively guide Biosphere 2. The trick is not so much in picking or choosing the species that will survive, but in entering a naturalist trance in which the intellect is still working and perceives a pattern, he told a reporter. It sounds mystical, but it is not. It is partly science, partly art. And that's like the whole like theme, Kathleen, who's another person, another sort of biospherian. She said like, she and the other biospherians who all were theater people had always wanted to be spiritual and secular at the same time, to become like traditional societies such as in Bali, Indonesia, which as we've really recently talked about on SJ, was like a huge fixation of like New Age people, like South Asia, because of like the Cold War context. That was like a huge source of a lot of these like Eastern philosophical ideas that they were kind of these sort of anthropologically mediated notions about what Southeast Asia was like. Yeah, where theater, I can imagine they're thinking about, the Wayang, which we talked about before. Theater, right, science, and the sacred were all one, all integrated with everyday life. But that idea, seemed blasphemous to media critics. This is what I'm talking about, is like how
it's all about the critics, the fucking
that aspect was there,
but
it's like, one of them says, I heard Johnny saying the whole biosphere was actually just theater. It's a theater performance, said Burns Abel. Kathleen helped them write their speeches for the Biosphere entry ceremony. She and her colleagues believed Biosphere 2 would include art and science together, in systems science, unity, totality, trance-like connection with the environment. But when the media declared it's not real science, she felt she had to hide, as though the theater, the artistic side, it wasn't even there. It affected all of us. I felt like I couldn't really say who I was. I've studied theater. I've taken I remember I had to take this one class once, as part of like a larger program that I was in, and it was like the weirdest thing that we had to do. It was like voice class, like voice training. And at one point they had us like sending our voice into our hands and trying to like speak, like resonate our voices like through like our extremities, like different parts of our body. And I was like, doesn't your voice come out of your mouth? You know, like, don't you make your voice with your vocal cords and then it like comes out of your mouth? And they're like, no, you know, because the sound is molecules, you know, in the air, like that are being moved and pushed around or like whatever. And so like, you know, the vibrations in any part of your body, like that's, you know, that also, I even forget what the explanation, it was like, I remember her saying very like explicitly, you know, that's not woo woo, that's science. And I'm like, and that was a moment that my faith in science broke. No, I'm just kidding. But like that, but it is my point. Like, you know, I had thought this previously to that, but like the sort of construct of like legitimate science is very porous and very unstable. And that's something you definitely see at play. You know, this is a great object lesson in that fact is Biosphere 2.
Well, yeah.
But I have a lot of memories from going to like in high school when I was involved in like my school's environmentalist club. It would send us sometimes to these like new agey, like kind of management training conferences, almost stuff that definitely was inspired, I think, a lot by Biosphere 2 and the Institute of Ecotechnics, where they would use that kind of language of science, like, no. When we're talking about the value of listening to plant spirits in the Amazon, that's both real shamanism from like real approved shamans, TM, you know, the white people telling us that, no, really, I heard this from a shaman, it's real. And also, it's confirmed by you know, biochemistry, and we've studied this. So it's both true in, you know, a non-Western sense and according to Western scientism. So they try to use that lens.
Yeah. That's the real sweet spot, you know.
It's also incredibly ironic that like there is supposed to be this sort of spiritual harmony with the environment, because I also read that the whole, basically, like there's this one sentence, let me see if I can find it. It was like a quote from basically this entire thing became like the entire ecosystem of Biosphere 2, like that was supposed to be sort of managed by them through this naturalist trance, like intuitively. It became basically a giant ant colony. Like the only species that were thriving were ones that were either like ant mutualists. Yeah, there were cockroaches too. They were either ant mutualists, ant resistant, or they can escape ant attack by being very small and subterranean. Cockroaches also ran rampant. Yeah, but yeah, the whole thing, like the tiny crazy ant, Paratrechina longicornis, was like the thriving, like definitive creature of Biosphere 2. So this wasn't really a mirror of Earth's ecosystem at all. Like a lot of the creatures they brought in, a lot of the animals, like the hummingbirds, they all died. All the bees and butterflies that were supposed to pollinate the rainforest died. Cockroaches overran the beehives. An uninvited bird appeared to be eating bees. The butterflies never made it and they just died. Yeah, and the ants, they never were even supposed to be there, but they somehow got in and they just completely took over.
I wondered that about the roaches. Like, did they bring some cockroaches with them, like, because it's part of the biome, or did they sneak in, like, through the dirt or something like that? Which means, I guess, it wasn't as, like, perfectly sealed as they thought. And the ants, too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess
it definitely
sealed
wasn't
from
sealed.
air, but, I mean, it had an underground thing, so there could have been, like, you know, some kind of crack or whatever. But no, it was definitely a fiasco in terms of like and like not replicable, which is what all the scientists said at the time, is that like this literally just like isn't science, because you can't, I guess maybe if you built like 2 of them, I don't know, but like doing it just once like doesn't prove anything. It lends credence to the idea, and I mean some of the ringleaders kind of say this, that like the real like power of Biosphere 2 was like in the imagination, was in the performance of it, to like get people to think differently about off-planet travel or like how vulnerable we are. Basically, that was like an environmentalist PR like super weapon that was just gonna like change, just blow everybody's mind and make them think differently about blah blah blah. Kind of like how like the whole pale blue dot, like, you know, astronaut thing, and like the Carl Sagan cliches about like we're just a little dot out here and we have to take care of it, like, but kind of done in like microcosm, so everybody, and turned into a media spectacle, blah blah blah. And I think they seem to kind of maybe Ed Bass and his like corporate suits didn't feel this way ultimately, but like the cult kind of felt like, you know, typical, I guess, theater people, that if that performance was successful in like changing people's consciousness, then like it was a success. And therefore, like the science is kind of like secondary to all this. Like they're not literally they weren't as hardcore about like proving it as if it were some kind of like game show challenge, maybe, as like the media thought, or they led the media on to think.
Was getting the meme into the consciousness, like the idea. And yeah, that definitely, they were a runaway success in those terms.
And it stays today, even though, I mean, it's funny, like Steve Bannon goes from like being the bad guy that kicks like the cult out of Biosphere 2 and then swings back around like 20 years later and is kind of like the crazy Mad Hatter of like the Trump MAGA. But at this point, like in alliance with Elon, who's also like the big, kind of came from a different direction as like the colony Mars guy builder, blah, 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 who's also like showing his ass lately is like actually not that scientifically brilliant of a person, etc. But like Bannon just keeps ending up around in this kind of pro-dome crowd. But I don't know, maybe Reid, before we riff anymore about like the Biosphere 2 itself, maybe should we talk about this group and its leader, Johnny Dolphin, aka John Allen?
Absolutely.
Can we get into that? Because I mean, him and the group are some fascinating bios, right? I think to say the least.
Really weird characters.
As I look at Biosphere 2 and I'm ready to enter, I take my last breaths of this atmosphere for 2 years.
We were pioneers. We were the first Biospherians.
How can you prepare yourself for journey into the unknown?
A biosphere is a closed system with plants and animals and the atmospheres all inside. We called it Biosphere 2 because Biosphere 1 is the Earth.
If we're going to go to Mars and the Moon, we better know how to make a biosphere.
Climate change is a threat. We were trying to counteract that threat.
We put in a rainforest, a desert, and an ocean with a living coral reef.
It was a global curiosity. 8 human beings separated from life.
I don't know any innovative human organization that doesn't have cult-like aspects.
We called ourselves synergists.
John Allen was a very good leader.
He was a mind musician.
Here is your brainwashing cult leader.
The 8 Biospherians are now quarantined together.
The negativity started.
Fighting is taking away from us accomplishing our objectives.
That set off alarms to me.
I don't want to talk about it.
Members took part in strange costumed rituals.
John Allen was having paranoid delusions.
Things were falling apart.
There was something to hide.
And this really shocking thing happened. There's a sudden spike in CO2.
We were suffocating and starving.
It was not legal.
Everything that could go wrong went wrong.
Here is this capsule of life from Earth. It was science fiction without the fiction.
This is an incredible moment. The future is here.
So Reid, can you tell us a little bit about how did this group come together and who is John Allen, the founder, the leader, quasi-guru of it? What's his deal? Where did he come from?
That's a very good question. So he's still alive. And his background was in engineering and metallurgy. He served as a machinist in the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1940s. And then he graduated from the Colorado School of Mines in 1957 with an engineering metallurgy degree. He then sort of started his career in that branch of engineering, working for a very interesting organization called the Battelle Institute in Columbus, Ohio, late 1950s, I think 1956.
How do you spell that?
Battelle is Battelle.
All right.
So as far as I could tell, he didn't do anything of that was that terribly interesting. The Battelle Institution, this was like his first job really out of engineering school. But the Battelle Institute itself is, it looms large in my mind, but it's notable for a couple of reasons. First is that it was one of the real big private research contractors in the first and second half of the 20th century in the United States. A couple of others, like the Armor Research Institution, had also been active, but it was the biggest and the most important, especially in the early Cold War. Maybe most notably or infamously, they handled some of the Project Blue Book contracts with the U.S. Air Force in the early 1950s. So anybody working there in the 50s is in a very good position to get connected to other, what we could broadly call weird science projects. And as far as it goes for a technician or a scientist, making some good deep state connections.
Yes. On that, there was another thing that I'd read that he had worked for in the 1950s. Apparently, he worked as an assistant to this guy, David Lillianthal, who
Yeah.
was very big in the field of atomic energy, right?
Yeah, he was the first chair of the Atomic Energy Commission.
Right.
Yeah, so he worked for Lilienthal's Development and Resources Corporation. I didn't get to do too much looking into this, but the three regions, at least that I found so far, that Alan worked in as part of the as an advisor to the vice president for the DRC, included regional projects in Iran, Liberia, and the Ivory Coast.
Yep, he was in Liberia, which was was he building that Omega Tower? I don't know.
The
That was
crazy
under
thing that jumped
President
out
Tubman, yeah.
The crazy thing that jumped out to me about David Lilienthal was that he apparently invented the term multinational corporation.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess he just invented the word, not the concept. But I guess he was like a really like for a while, like John Allen was like a baller, like finance guy, like on Wall Street, basically, right?
Yeah, that's essentially what he did after working for Lilienthal's corporation. And that's where he sort of makes all the money that he uses to at least capitalize the early projects and the various compounds that he founds around the world. One thing to talk about just before we get into the rest of the Synergia Ranch crowd is that, Khalid, like you said, Alan's really got that theater producer kind of psycho mentality. But like Steve Bannon, in many ways, his origin really is in finance. Even though he started as an engineer himself, his real background and what really gives him the ability to have, to play out all these, kind of quacky, kind of big air quotes, unconventional ideas was his early success, as an investment guy on Wall Street.
Yeah, I remember there was like this passage in a reader's book where he's talking about kind of like sitting in his office, like looking out. At age 32 in 1963, he found himself sitting in an office building in New York City. One day he had an epiphany. He looked out at the sky and realized he could not even open his own window in his skyscraper office. Again, this is kind of probably from like as told by John Allen. So again, like take this with a grain of salt, it's a little bit mythologized. But he was trapped by his supposed success. At that moment, he saw a Yugoslavian freight ship heading out to sea to North Africa, and he decided to go, as he later recalled. Those are all gorgeous windows in my shining skyscraper, giving me $1 million views of the world's splendid traffic, but I can't open them to smell the fresh air, hike barefoot along an open road, or worst of all, walk away from a pompous power holder. Get me out of here. I knew what I had to do next. Get on the next Yugoslav freighter headed east to Tangiers. I had people to see and places to go where I hadn't the slightest idea what would happen next. All right. So
As you do. As you do.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. He also
So-
did go to Harvard at one point, right? Which it was where he encountered like a lot of intellectual influences, right? Was it Harvard Business School? I think that it.
Yeah, I
actually
think
went
he
to?
has an MBA
Yeah.
from Harvard. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
He
and that's where he
graduated at the
first
top of his
saw
class.
Buckminster Fuller, right? He
Mhm.
ran across him there. Yeah, who was also
Also-
definitely like a big influence on all of this.
Yeah, another
Um,
weird thing because he grew up in like Oklahoma, kind of like in the Dust Bowl, and at one point, or he claims this that he like roamed around the West, became a fruit farmer in Washington State, and worked as a leftist labor organizer in the Chicago meat packing houses in the 1950s. I think I saw one reference that he like did labor agitation alongside Paul Robeson in the 50s in like Chicago. Like he had this weird like Saul Alinsky arc for a little while and then went on to the Army Corps of Engineers and then like went on, into like mining, engineering, popped around in like Iran and Liberia and a bunch of other places, and then goes and does finance. And I guess he was writing poems and plays like in his spare time as he was doing all that stuff. But then it wasn't until, he looked out his window and realized like he had his Don Draper moment, man, and realized, and then saw a Yugoslav freighter, just had to jump on it and started going around the world. Yeah, which leads him on like kind of this like spiritual, very typical, like, just like all these other big 60s figures, like going on his little vision quest around the world. And actually, I think it was at Harvard, right, where he first encountered the writings of W.R. Bion, who was a British psychologist who studied group behavior during World War II. And reading Bion, Alan became intrigued by the science of group dynamics, a subject that would become increasingly important in his own life. So, yeah, he got really into that guy. Is that also where he first discovered Gurdjieff at Harvard?
I'm not sure when he discovered Gurdjieff. I mean, it was very interesting reading like in Vasey's account, like what the sort of core texts were
Mm-hmm.
of the sort of Synergia group. Because yeah, that one was one of them. Like it was definitely an eclectic collection. Like that one was one of them. Like the science of group dynamics and like a lot of Gurdjieff, like Idris Shah, like heavily represented
Oh
as
yeah.
well. Like
Oh,
who
yeah.
we did
Quote
an
unquote
episode on.
Sufism, as
Yeah,
interpreted by
quote
Idris
unquote.
Shah, was a
Yeah.
big hit with this guy.
Yes, very typical, like kind of new age soup stuff. I mean, Shah, as we talked about in our episode, really is like a Gurdjieffian, so it kind of fits, with his general influence by Gurdjieff. Yeah, and then there was another book that was a big influence. It was like history, like it was like technics, right? What was the name of that book? I took a note of it in the workflow. Wait, let me see if I can bring it up.
I forget which
Yeah,
one,
the
which author.
the Technics and Civilization. Yeah, this is
Was
an
that
interesting
Mumford? Was
book.
that Lewis Mumford?
Yeah, Lewis Mumford.
Yeah, he loved
yeah,
Lewis
yeah.
Mumford.
Yeah, but I'm not sure when he first encountered like all those things. Definitely Buckminster Fuller would have seen at Harvard.
Yeah, he did. I think he attended a lecture by Buckminster. He got Bucky
Yeah.
pilled. And then like when he was on his, spiritual quest, like he went to Morocco where all the beats were hanging out. He also loved William S. Burroughs, who had become a huge like supporter of Synergia Ranch and Biosphere later, and went to India. He like hitchhiked across Africa and then went to India. He sat at the feet of Hindu karma yogis and Tibetan lamas seeking new teachings. Like we all know the drill. As Ben Epperson, who received postcards from his friend, put it, he sort of realized in the East that there were things that he didn't understand how they did. He wanted to find out. And here's the first, like, he meets his first accomplice in India, I guess, in Old Delhi. Alan met Marie Harding, who, that book calls a long-haired, bright young American woman from a well-to-do East Coast family. She was, like him, making her way around the planet, quote, to get a picture of what's really going, in Alan's words. They met up again in Vietnam, in Saigon. Marie was working as a field nurse at a jungle hospital for tribal peoples in the mountains. John followed her there. She was, quote, one of the most fearless and capable planetary explorers I've ever met, he later wrote. They got married there in Vietnam. Now, just a second about Mary Harding. First of all, it's like interesting that they just like run into each other in India. She's obviously a rich girl doing the spirituality thing. Like, I think the documentary actually really tries to like play down how the high waspiness of like John Allen's followers is like almost completely just like erased from the documentary.
It's
but
amazing. Like
here
they're
on
all
SJ,
like
I think
the same type of like they're all like from the same
we who have eyes
milieu,
to see can
basically.
see.
There was that one
there's
guy.
There's a passage in a Texas Monthly article from 1989 that points out that at least half of the 25 residents of Synergia Ranch were Ivy League graduates.
Mhm.
So it's absolutely a very uniform, very specific kind of, and that waspy mentalities we'll get into. It fits with what Vesey calls the do-it-yourself libertarian Stakhovnite kind of for the group.
The frontierism.
There was one great quote from Vasey where he said like that the new age seemed to be like the new social order comes to seem like the last outpost of Massachusetts Bay Colony. Just like to be like
that's like such a great line.
There's
it really is
later
though.
on. There's a part later on where they go like touring their theater company, and like I guess there wasn't a great reception like in Boston, and like they were especially like outraged. They're like Harvard, like that's the thing, like that's like the North Star is like what like is Harvard gonna accept? Like we're breaking away from society, man, but also like Harvard needs to like know that we're good. Like we need like and that was part of the like Vasey says that's part of the reason why he was able to like get in was because they're like, oh, an academic like wants to write a book about us, and they're still like very much like invested in that sort of legitimacy, totally fits and totally a type. I just have to say, like, such a type.
Extremely,
like
extremely so.
the woo-woo theater guy who, like, also, like, his entire worldview revolves around, like, Harvard and, like, how smart everyone is at Harvard,
Yeah.
So it's very much an Ira Einhorn parallel because Einhorn was obsessed with getting into fellowship at the Kennedy School of Government, which he eventually did in the same period in the late 70s. But they're Allen and Einhorn, very, very, very similar kinds of guy.
Yeah. I think Marie Harding, if I do recall correctly, in the documentary, she describes her like her questing thing as being like, I grew up in like New England. I just didn't want to have that like New England middle class like lifestyle. So I left. It's like, bitch, middle
She
class. Like,
actually,
come
I
on.
looked into
Like,
her a little bit
like,
because
okay. Like,
I
you're
looked into
not.
her.
Yeah, her dad
Yeah.
is a financier in Boston,
Mhm.
right?
Well, I looked into her a little bit, and her family does have strong ties to Boston, but they're actually like in the textile business. Like, so I guess you could call them like financiers, but like yeah, like she actually grew up on Long Island.
Oh,
She was the daughter of, I want to say, Lewis Harding the third. I
okay.
made a little sub note about her in that part of the Vasey book that calls her a Boston financier. Yeah, let's see. Charles Lewis Harding Jr., a textile manufacturer who did grow up on Long Island, but she like her the father of Charles Lewis Harding, Charles Lewis Harding Sr., he was in the same trade. There's actually, and they were old Harvard men. Charles Lewis Harding Jr. like wrote in to the 20th anniversary report of the Harvard class of 1926, talked about his experience in the war. Yeah, in Syosset, Long Island. That's where he was based. Before
Okay,
joining the
yeah.
Navy in 1942, I was with my present company, Meinhard Grief & Co., Textile Factors, as assistant vice president, handling their various mill accounts and soliciting new business. During the spring of 1942, I attempted to get a commission in whatever branch of the service would take me in, and the first opportunity was offered by the Bureau of Supplies and Accounts in Washington to take charge of the purchasing of the Navy's woolen piece and goods and blanket requirements. I started as a civilian employee in August 1942 and got my commission a few weeks thereafter. I stayed on this job for the entire period of the war. I was located at Washington except for the last 6 months when our buying unit was transferred to New York City. My purchases ran, wow, 100 million a year. That's what it says here. And I
Oh, yeah,
had
yeah.
up to 85 different woolen and worsted mills operating for the Navy during that period. After getting out of the Navy on October 15th, 1945, and taking a vacation in Florida, I went back to my old company as vice president and director. I belonged to the Racket and Tennis Club, the Harvard Club, the Manhattan Club, and the Merchants Club. I continued to play quite a lot of squash and tennis.
I bet he does. I bet he does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's
All of
Marie Harding's father.
everybody
Yeah.
on like her paternal line, all of the Charles Lewis Hardings have their wedding announcements in the New York Times. I just Googled. And try this one on for size just to get a sense of the old Boston Brahmin roots. This is from the Cambridge Tribune, April 4th, 1891. Death of Charles L. Harding. He died Wednesday at his home, 560 Cambridge Street. Mr. Harding was well known in the commercial circles of Boston from his identity with the woolen trade. He was born 1814, a son of Honorable Lewis Harding. He left home early in life and began his career as a woolen manufacturer when 20 years of age at Millville, Mass. From Millville, he went to Oxford, where he operated a woolen mill for several years. In 1852, he bought out the Curlington Woolen Company at Hurlington, Vermont, and with two brothers conducted the business till 1862, where he sold out the greater part of his interest in that company and came to Boston, residing, however, in Cambridge, in the same house where he has lived ever since and where he died. In 1865, he became associated with Gardner R. Colby, Bill Colby's grandfather. No, just kidding. Maybe not, though. In the wool and commission business, which continued with only three changes in the firm up to the time of his death, the present firm being Harding, Whitman, and Company. Mr. Harding was for some years a director in the Washington Mills of Lawrence and treasurer of the Lowell Manufacturing Company. In 1866, he became the principal owner of the Merchants Woolen Company of Dedham, Mass., retaining this interest up to his death. He was an alderman during Honorable O'Houghton's term as mayor and was one of the advisory board that instituted the Cambridge Hospital. He was also, at the time of his death, a director in the North National Bank of Boston. So, like, that was 1891. So, yeah, we're talking about old money, right?
Yeah.
Wow, Miss Eleanor Pratt was the honor maid at C.L. Harding Jr.'s wedding, as reported in the New York Times.
Is
Reception
that
at the Colony
Charles
Club.
L. Harding Charles Lewis Harding, is that Marie's grandfather? Seems a
Might
little
be
bit
her
old.
it might be her grandfather because, well, Junior was her father, right?
Yeah, Junior was her father, definitely. Yeah, he lists Marie, his daughter, born on November 13th, 1941. So, but
And
then, like, if he was in the class of 1926 at Harvard, then that doesn't make any sense
that
for
might be
this
her
guy to have been
that
his,
might be her
yeah.
great
So then
grandfather.
I
Maybe
guess,
the name
yeah,
might have
that's so
skipped a
weird.
generation. The name might have
Yeah,
skipped a
maybe.
generation. Yeah, because
Yeah.
they're all
But th
Charles
that
Lewis
doesn't
Harding
really
the
work with
third.
juniors, though. Yeah, I guess he might have to be Charles Lewis Harding the third. I don't know. Yeah,
No,
he
no, no.
says
I'm pretty sure we have the right family. Like
no,
I'm
this is
sure
definitely
it's
the
just
right
yeah,
family.
yeah,
I'm just
yeah.
wondering, like, who this guy, like, where he factors in and like how the juniors like jumped. definitely Charles Lewis Harding Jr. is her father.
Her father, yeah. So that's that was his wedding in 1930, reception at Colony Club, attended by Miss Eleanor Pratt, I assume from the Pratt family of like Pratt Institute, right? History of the Great American Fortunes. So she's pretty like high up there, manages to like, just skate past kind of acknowledging that, I feel like, in the entire documentary. But these books do like get into it. In fact, the profile of like Vasey's book kind of profiles like all the main people that were there when he stayed with them in the early 70s. And I started like counting them up, and it felt like 40% came from that exact background of like New England, old like Mayflower family with money that like went to an Ivy League but either dropped out or graduated, then like didn't want to like live the straight life man or something, or got into theater.
There was one guy who they mentioned as like having like a family fortune that was like of big use to them, Randall Gibson.
Right.
And I was trying to figure out like where did his fortune come? Was he related to Randall L. Gibson?
I don't know.
Yeah, do you know, Reid?
No, I'm checking through my notes right now, but I don't recall.
Yeah, I was wondering if he was related to like the Confederate Randall L. Gibson.
Oh, I see. Former senator, general in the Confederate Army from Kentucky. There we go with Sussex, Kentucky
did have
people
like
again.
plantations and stuff, so maybe that could have come to be like a fortune. I was like when you say a family fortune, I'm thinking of like, it's like I'm thinking like what is these big Gibson families, but that could be sufficient to like, help finance Synergia.
And they intermarry as well. So they reinvigorate their fortunes. Actually, one of that Gibson's, Randall L. Gibson, his grandson was Henry Field of the Chicago Field fortune. So obviously they intermarried at some point. And his career, he was an anthropologist and an archaeologist, actually. Could be connected, but it's definitely of a type. And then I would say the predominant other grouping of people are like kind of like middle class to like upper middle class, like college educated Catholics and Jews are like the rest of the followers are pretty much like what it is. And I think who's the other guy that's like a fucking live wire and is just like fucking like Tom Moshering out all the time and like on the ranch, and like he has some wacky name. What was his name? Like Butch or something? No. You guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, is this T? Is this abbreviated to T in the book?
I remember the T episode, but I don't.
Was it T?
I don't know if that's what you're talking about. He was the one who like needed to be like excoriated because he like was
Champ.
He secretly hated Jews or whatever.
It was Champ.
Alan accused him of trying to kill the one Jewish girl, right?
He made some kind of accident where like I don't know, what was
the wheel, the lug nut on the bus wheel was like not tightened properly, so then like the wheel fell off while one of the girls was driving, and then at one of these dinners at the ranch, John Allen accused him of, because he's a WASP from New England, that like he secretly wanted to kill this girl because she's Catholic.
Yeah, it was this bizarre like Synanon psychoanalysis, like attack therapy session where he was like, admit that you wanted to kill her.
The way that he did it was he accused T of trying to kill the girl, said that T actually secretly hated both her specifically and another woman named, and that he in fact disliked all women, and the girl who was involved in this incident basically says quietly joining these accusations. Then Allen attacked T in terms of his upper-class New England background, a theme to which he also returned on other evenings in various connections. The girl whose car had been, quote, sabotaged was a Catholic. The other girl he disliked was a Jew. The Protestant New Englanders really fixed tires for Catholics or Jews, he insinuated. So absolutely just weaponizing his background, his third wife's background as, Synanon mind game stuff.
It really is. It really is. And like, it seems like in this weird way that like these people kind of like eat it up and like they crave being like told what a bad little wasp they are by like this fucking guru, like, and to be like shamed for like their weird attitudes around money, which I guess he also had, Marie, right? Harding. I guess the one,
by the way, I don't know if we mentioned, but became like his wife, by the time
they did get married.
Writes the book, like they're like basically they're still married, but they're not like living together. There's this one part where like
she's on the ranch, but like not together.
Yeah, exactly. And she's like, according to Vasey, she's like close to somebody else at that time, and it seems like John Allen has like at least like a flirtation, if not like relationships, with, like a lot of the women on the compound. Although he doesn't really go into it fully because I assume he doesn't have like the details really. There's that one part where outside of the influence of Idris Shah, who like nominally is like the like Naqshbandi Sufi or whatever, the one reference to Islam among all these like sort of Eastern traditions that he's sampling from is when he says like they had the right idea about like polygamy, or like he makes some kind of like wistful notion like, oh yeah, like that that's a better way to do things or something.
Yeah, they're so fucking weird. But going back for a second to okay, so like this guy also, it said in I think the Vasey book that Allen did like some private humanitarian projects in South Vietnam, like in the early 60s. And I just wanted to flag there that it's like interesting that sure, I guess there's like Buddhist monks in South Vietnam in the early 60s that you could just go because you're so spiritual and want to hang out. But it is a kind of specific place to like volunteer and go when like US covert operations are like ticking up pretty like aggressively in this is what, like 63, 64. So this is still kind of like the late JFK, like pre-Gulf of Tonkin kind of like special war period where we're like definitely sending like military advisors. But there's a lot of, unofficial like military sort of activity. And I did see that organization, that company, what was it, the DRC that he worked for, they actually did have like a project throughout the mid 60s. Yeah, the Development and Resources Corporation, David Lilienthal's company, they had this like project in the Mekong River Delta that was like, I don't know, it sounds, I don't know if it's exactly this, but it sounds a little bit like Strategic Hamlet Initiative of like finding ways to like foster like microfinancing, economic development, blah blah blah, to like keep the Viet Cong out. You know what I mean? Like Phoenix program adjacent type shit. And I wonder if like John Allen, like his purpose for going to Vietnam wasn't just to like go on a spiritual quest because he jumped on a Yugoslav freighter, etc. But like he had some reason to go there. Marie Harding was working at some kind of like nonprofit or something like that, which is where they met up and got married. But just something interesting to flag. I mean, I don't know. But then, they marry and then they kind of like go back to the United States together. And they actually, correct me if I'm wrong, Reid, like they go to New Mexico before they start their whole weird 60s theater thing. Like they go to New Mexico and they're hanging out and they're kind of like talking. They want to do theater, right? Like, I think that's what Marie says when they get married. It's like, I want to do theater and like change the world. And he's like, me too. That's what all these stories are like. Like they just have some like wacky conversation that probably didn't happen. And they run off together. But then they hear about the Summer of Love and San Francisco, where it's all going down. And I guess John Allen just decides like, that's where it's at. We got to move there. And so he and Marie moved there in 1967. Is that correct?
Yeah, that sounds right to me. And they bounce around between there and the West End in New York City as well before they go back to the high desert in New Mexico.
Right. I think he said that, he had some crazy, or he had some very effusive quote. Oh, he said the West Village, quote, had been the center of everything that was vital in the United States. And he said the only thing it was missing was scientists. Weird. Okay.
Well, that comes out of like, if I'm not mistaken about what you're quoting, there was like that whole like episode in Vasey's book, because like part of life on the compound was that like John Allen would just like hold court in these like sessions like every dinner time, and he would like do this thing that just sounds infuriating, where like he would introduce a topic, but then like invite people to talk about it like however they wanted, but like then like you kind of had to guess like how he wanted you to talk about it, because like otherwise he would just get grumpy and like start sending signals. Like, and for instance, like with the West Village, like a lot of the people, or like, yeah, it was the Village in general. I don't know. It might have been, I think it was the West Village specifically, because people started to talk about the East Village and he would like shoot them down. Like, no, talking about the West Village.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. He specified.
And like, Yeah. But then like people started to get nostalgic, like, yeah, I used to live in the West Village, like which like of course, speaks to the sort of demographic of this place. Like a lot of them did, and like, that was like kind of their background. Like, and like, oh yeah, back in those times, like you're kind of like, reminiscing nostalgically, and he like got like furious and angry that they were like being nostalgic. And like, he was like, I need to like crush this. And he's like, no, actually, it was like this vital explosion of artistic energy, but then it like became corrupted, like it lost its way, and like, yeah, it just like had to go on this bizarre rant about the West Village. It
He's
was
like the most annoying hipster. He's also, let's also like point out, like so many of the gurus of the late 60s. I didn't appreciate this till more recently, but he's like 40 and he's hanging out with like Marie Harding, I think is in her early 20s at this point, and like every other follower that he picks up, I feel like is like pretty young. They're like mostly under like 25. Some of them are just like literally like 18-year-olds. And then here comes this like 40-year-old guy who's just like, hey, what's up, kids? Like, and he seems really interesting and stuff. But there's definitely a age gap. There's some age gap discourse that could be had with Alan, and kind of his like sway as like this older hipster that like he was around for indie sleaze. He remembers the beats. Like you little kids weren't around, and I think that was like a vibe with a lot of these like Allen Ginsberg, Neil Cassidy, Ken Kesey, Tim Leary kind of types. Like these guys had been running around doing sus CI shit, for over a decade. So they had so many stories to tell. And these like little boomers, like, they're getting their minds blown for the first time. These guys were like right there waiting to like, to kind of draw them in.
This is what Vasey says about the conversation. He suddenly lashed out at certain persons in strong terms, accusing them of, quote, lying and of suppressing their real feelings in all this storytelling, even though one should recall it was he who first introduced them who had first encouraged them to open up. He said the village had a deeper meaning for them and they would acknowledge as a symbol of emancipation from their parents. Again, calling him Ezra, that's like the pseudonym for him, but I'm just going to read Ezra. This is actually John Allen. Ezra's tone became ever more intense until it succeeded in killing the happy nostalgia. He bore down on several individuals, demanding they come clean with what they had been previously, quote unquote, suppressing. Two of the young men confessed with actual sobs that the village had stood for the kind of rupture with their middle class parents that they had been incapable of making during their teenage years. This admission of personal inward battle and inability to break free produced a profound wave of emotion at the table. These two stood revealed in sharp contrast to the larger number whose reminiscences showed that they had easily entered a pronounced bohemian phase early in their lives, even if they had later grown beyond it. Between these confessions and Ezra's harping accusations that some people were quote-unquote lying about what they really felt, the entire table was now gripped by a mood of high-pitched inner agitation. Then Ezra began to lecture forcefully about the West Village as the one-time cultural capital of the United States. He said that it was calculatedly destroyed by economic interests who tore enough of the old buildings down to kill its flavor. Much was convincing in this historical recapitulation, though parts of it sounded too conspiratorial. The West Village, he went on, had been the center of everything that was vital in the United States. This was demonstrable because, first of all, everyone inside New York looked up to it as the place where one could get away from the humdrum and the routine, experiencing art and theater and cultural innovation. While secondly, everyone of any creative aspiration who lived outside New York looked to that city as a whole in the same manner. Its only failing as a cultural climate, as we noted, was its lack of a scientific resonance. Our own community, he said, using a phrase he repeated with great emphasis, is to be a community of actors and scientists. Thus, it is more balanced intellectually than the village had ever been. What came through very strongly in all of this was Ezra's identification with the older Bohemian tradition in America, and thus, interestingly enough, with freedom in that classic sense. All right.
Oh
yeah.
my God. I'm just imagining
There's just
being
so
like
much insane shit in there. Like
I'm just imagining like locked in a room with like Hamilton Morris coked out of his mind, like ranting about how like Williamsburg used to be awesome when like Vice was there, and like how like the corporate people ruined. Like every hipster kind of like could make this kind of rant, but he's so profound.
On the other hand, like I feel like this is like another thing like that I kind of, obviously like there's a like young impressionable people who are like kind of looking for an authority figure to mold them, like are susceptible to this type of thing in general. But I also feel like actors, I was never someone who like wanted to be an actor, even though like, I like performed in plays when I was like very young. But like, I've known a lot of actors since I worked in theater, and like acting is all about like imitating. And it's all about being like open and receptive to like the signals other people are giving you, and like being in that sort of playful, like plastic, open. So like that whole thing of like being able to like receive the signals you're getting from like your scene partner or like your frame of reference, like that's kind of what's happening like in that scene, right? Like they're looking
Right.
for cues from him in order to like match his energy, you know? And like so that like feeds in so well. And that's why I think there's so much overlap between these type of things. And like that sort of and that's why like that persona like gravitates so well to like both worlds. Like I've like again, like I said, like there's so many like John Allens out there. Like I remember like
Yeah, definitely.
being at one rehearsal room came to my mind as I was reading this. Like there's this dude who like also had like accusations against him, you know, but still like managed to like again, if people think like film is like ridden with like Me Too stuff, like theater is like a million times worse and a million times more insular, and like much more of it is like, you know, like just never gonna come to light. But like yeah, you know, he still had a career and everything. And I remember like, you know, he was the same type of thing where everyone like latched on to him as like this intellectual force because he could do like, you know, he was telling people how to, he was like had these little idiosyncratic ways and like had the secret to like the iambic pentameter and Shakespeare and stuff like that. And I remember, you know, one time like he was like yelling at someone because they were putting emphasis on the not in some like line of pentameter, because like in Shakespeare, you know, not is kind of like it's not emphasized, you know, like you're not supposed to be like I do not, you know, it's always like I do not, or like whatever. And someone like did it wrong, and then he started screaming at her, and then she just coughed, and he flipped out and was like, it is not, like he thought that she was trying to say that like she messed up because she had a cold or like a sore throat or something, and that she was trying to get out of it. You know, it's that same thing of like,
Wow.
you're freaking like, how
Yeah.
dare you? Like, you know,
Oh
no,
my
it's not
God.
because you have a cold. Like, it's because you are unprofessional, or like, you know, something like and that like insane type of personality. There's
Yeah.
a like a dime a dozen people like that, and
Oh
it's
yeah.
just
My like high
yeah,
school theater director was low key like that type of person. Like, you know, like they
yeah,
could just like they could be like very they have a hold over you in that kind of space, and everyone is kind of very open and vulnerable. It's really the perfect cover for having like a cult. Is like, no, we're
absolutely,
just doing
yeah,
like theater because you would make them do exhaustive theater exercises throughout every single day, in addition to these like psychological
yeah.
games after dinner, where it'd be like
Hmm.
walking through a minefield and you have to like don't say anything that's going to set him off or else he's going to set on you. But then it's like an exercise, so you have to go with it. You have to roll with it, you know?
Exactly.
Like so you have to participate or else you're not being a good player, you know,
And
blah
like
blah
all it
blah.
like yeah, like Grotowski like running around in circles until you like all these like techniques that are like kind of like brainwashing techniques are also acting techniques. And that's
Yeah.
why like there's so much overlap between like these two worlds, which is why I think like studying that type of stuff is like so useful for like piercing the veil of like some of this bullshit. Because yeah, like it really like is a huge like undercurrent in all
Yeah.
this.
Yeah,
Like
I think
yeah.
a big part of this is that idea of a community of actors and scientists, which is
Mm.
what the Synergia
Yeah.
Ranch project was supposed to inculcate in its members. As both of you are talking about, it's basically an experiment in management science, right? You know, you have this guy who's a high finance dude who does have, you know, background in engineering. He's interested in theater or whatever. But the through line through all these projects is studying new ways of controlling people, and in
Hmm.
particular, controlling them while giving them specific actionable skills. So that's something
Hmm.
that Ed Bass is quoted as describing when he hires Synopco, the Synergetic Operations Corporation, which was run by a couple of the members of the cult at the ranch, to build some apartment building for him. And it's described as having a unique approach to management, a system based on the notion of, quote, willing incompetence.
Hmm.
Exactly. If you have the drive, you can learn. So Sinopco hired unskilled hippie laborers and ostensibly turned them into specialists, and local craftsmen were brought in to provide on-the-job training. So that whole idea of taking people with maybe no or limited background in theater, definitely no background in science of any kind, with the exception of Al and maybe one or two other members, sort of giving them either the identity of being able to do those things or actually some competence, which appears to have been the case after many years with the Caravan of Dreams theater production company.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's very much a study in social control. And I just want to read from Vasey the description of the effect that this had that he observed on the cult members
Hmm.
Hmm.
very strongly as, let me see. Here it is. Okay. So um, Ezra's domination of the group is open and for the most part undisguised. To the uninitiated, his influence could seem almost unbearably pervasive. One soon realizes that every small practice which makes up this complicated rhythm of daily life, that's between the work, the dinners, the other kind of weird ritualized, it was all, they lived very thriftily, and everyone was expected to work in multiple jobs throughout the day to try to earn money. But you would have to go and rent tools that were owned or loaned by other members of the cult. Ultimately, the ranch itself was owned by Marie Harding, apparently. I think she was actually who used her family money to buy the ranch, or at least capitalized it. But then everything else you had to borrow or rent, or ask for permission to borrow from other people. And as Vasey says, though he rarely takes part in routine labor, Alan wanders about the property frequently, choosing what and whom to see. As he passes by, everyone's inner attention automatically turns toward him, even though tasks are still being performed. Suddenly, and it might be anywhere, Ezra will explode into wrath, usually directed at one person. Calmly in control of himself 1 minute, in the next he will be shouting the most hurtful words conceivable in furious assault upon the ego of some trapped individual. And during these rages, he'll accuse the person of harboring deliberately destructive motives, often involving the way in which a task has been performed. So definitely, Khalid, like you were describing, that real psycho theater producer mentality where it doesn't matter that you just did something wrong. Whatever their insane interpretation or their manipulative and abusive interpretation of whatever you do next is more fuel for you're a terrible person, you're a wrecker, you're trying to sabotage this perfect vision that I and everybody else here have.
Yeah.
But I guess unlike a theater production, it's sort of like they're constantly rehearsing for something that is sort of like never ending. So they don't even have at least the if we're gonna put a psycho theater director on the dock and ask them to defend themselves, they might say, yeah, but like it's all in the service of like getting to the ultimate performance and like putting this is what you got to do to like you got to shake them up a little bit and then to get that magic. But in this case, I mean, it's kind of like a never ending, this entire project. And I guess we should say, like, the theater group he founds in San Francisco is the Theater of All Possibilities. They start doing experimental theater, but then he starts to feel about San Francisco the way he felt about the West Village, that it like kind of sold out, man. And there's too many dope heads and blah 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 and fakers and blah blah blah. So he decides he's going to take this group that he's sort of like recruited of actors to New Mexico. Harding is going to use her family money to buy some land on like a kind of a derelict ranch, and then they're all gonna build it up into this big project and blah blah blah. So when we get to the early 70s, when like Vasey like encounters them, I think they're like a year or two into living on what they call Synergia Ranch. And that's where all these like that's where he discovers all these like Synanon game fucking dynamics going on. And ostensibly they are a theater group that puts on plays locally, and then like you said, everyone makes like a lot of people make like bespoke handicrafts, like sort of antiques, they make like chairs and tables and stuff, and that's how they like raise money to sort of like live on the ranch. And then at one point, a big like breakthrough for them is when they build a kind of geodesic dome, like rehearsal space that is modeled after like Buckminster Fuller's ideas. And they're very proud that like they're all able to come together and do this. So that's like the first big achievement of the Theater of All Possibilities. But then after a couple years, then John Allen gets like his next crazy idea. I think we mentioned it, like the building the boat, the Heraclitus. So they moved to Berkeley. That's where I think they use Randall Gibson's The Heir to a Family Fortune. He contributes most of the $90,000 they need to build a boat from scratch, which they do. Once again, like I'm just struck by kind of like like the ease of boomer life, where it's like while they're doing this, like this cult is working 12-hour days building a boat. I guess they're just allowed to like build a boat on the fucking shores of the bay. I feel like you get arrested if you did that today. And then they just go and open like a burger shop in Berkeley called the Junkman's Palace, where they served hamburgers to the resident bohemians. So it's like, I don't know, in between being a cult, working 12 hours a day, like illegally building a boat on the Bay Area shore, they just like open, I guess it's John Allen's business acumen, but still, it's kind of like, what the fuck? Like, it's so easy just to open a fucking burger shop and like make a bunch of money to finance a boat building. Like, ain't like that anymore. It's, I guess,
Yeah,
but
I know. I
it
was
seems
thinking
so
like you would be
easy for these
shot if you
people.
did what they did. Yeah, like I was thinking today, like if you tried to
What
like
the
build your own
fuck?
boat and just take it out into the harbor, like you would just be like shot,
Yeah,
like
well,
or something.
it sounds like they almost did get shot because while the just the website for the boat project itself, the rvheraclitus.org, describes it again in a very glowing, this is like Explorers Club style terms. Oh, the ship sailed over 270,000 nautical miles across 6 oceans, exploring the traditions of those who have lived on the sea, blah, 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 trying to create a contemporary cadre of sea people. However, as the one member of the Heraclitus crew is quoted as describing, they had to, right, this guy, Greg Dugan, nicknamed Chutney for some reason, brought in as the general manager, and he worked on the theater of all possibilities. When he had been on the crew of the Heraclitus boat, he, quote, faced down Yemeni patrol boats in the Red Sea.
Whoa.
So the question is, when you're just exploring the various civilizations and ways of being a sea person, you just happen to get in trouble with Yemen's patrol boats? What are you really doing over there?
Was that when they were socialist? It'd be interesting. It might have been because they, or at least part of Yemen, sort of broke off. It was South Yemen, I want to say. It might have been around this time. Yeah, they went to a lot of different locations where I could say, oh, that's kind of interesting. Just popping in a wacky little theater group.
It would have been during that time because the People's Republic of Southern Yemen was 1967 to 1990. So it would have been the period that
So
they were
it probably
communists.
was like they were, they're going to the Red Sea shipping lane. Wow, interesting. So almost got blown up, but yeah, they were ostensibly, going around doing like theater, but also like the act itself of sailing around the world meant they were like controlled by no one except, I guess, John Allen. They were totally free. And, it sounds like from both these books that the theater, the quality of the theater, Vasey says that definitely
Yeah,
suffered,
was
I
low.
think.
Yeah.
Given that these people were like working like 12-plus-hour days, like 7 days a week, and were constantly like living in fear of getting like psychologically deconstructed by John Allen and et cetera, et cetera. And so they were always like very exhausted and kept very, classic like cult techniques of like keep people tired, slightly underfed, and they'll just kind of get into like a zombie rhythm after a while. And I guess Vasey said like the quality of the plays that he saw like was sort of declining while he was there, and
Yeah.
and
Right,
some of
he
the
said it
newer
kind of
recruits were not
ran.
actors also. So like
He said it
some of
kind
the
of
early
ran the
theater
gamut,
people.
right? Like some of them were okay, but some of them were just like Shakespeare, for instance, he said was particularly bad because no one understood what they were saying. Like,
Mm.
yeah, it's just like awful. But like some of them, like some of their like because they did like self-compose like little farces that sort of like reflected on their, or like I don't know, like they were all farcical, but like they would kind of reflect on their own community. There was that one that
They
was
did that through the
I remember,
80s.
yeah, there was an insane song where like this is probably written by John himself. This comes from a play. We all hope he's a teacher. We fear that he is a lecher. How can we gain Satori, not just adorn his glory? These questions shake our minds. It used to be so easy. If you wanted to learn, you went to a university or off to India by air or sea. Took up art or science, philosophy or seance. But we're the sophisticated, Aquarian generation, and all the past we've hated, prayed for the new creation. Who is there to teach us? Who is there to reach us? John, at least's a candidate. He's better than the state. Before we lynch or leave him, we'll try to believe him. That comes from one of the group's original plays, probably written by John himself. Nora and
Yeah,
one of the two
odd
others would
vibes of
spontaneously
like
sing out these
thinking.
passages while washing
Yeah.
dishes late at night.
Mhm.
All right,
Yeah, it's weird that he
interesting.
jumps to like lynch him as like kind of a first, just the vocabulary.
Well,
Interesting.
yeah, it's like that kind of like martyr complex, like, oh, you all just want, you all hate me, like you all just want to cast me by the side of the road, but like, yeah.
Right.
Really telling on himself too by the
Yeah.
oh, we think he's a leader, oh, but we worry he's a lecher. I wonder why they're worried.
Yeah.
They always say that,
Yeah.
don't they? Like, I'm not your guru. Like, don't follow me. Wink, wink. I just
Yes.
want to read this next passage from Dreaming the Biosphere because it's going to introduce another person we need to like talk about a little bit. They write while they were building the boat and while they were like sailing around, with the boat and everything or getting it ready. They say that, meanwhile, some of the most important future determining events in the group's life were happening more quietly. The same year that the ship was under construction, another young, mild mannered idealist arrived at Synergia Ranch. His arrival would prove more significant than anyone there could have imagined upon first meeting him. He had dropped out of architecture graduate school at Yale and moved to New Mexico in 1970. Like so many of the other Synergians, he yearned to really do something with his ideas. Quote, I'd spent, what does it come out to, 18 years in school, and to get out and practice things and learn things by doing them and so forth, at that time was tremendously stimulating, he said. His name was Ed Bass, and he and his three brothers happened to be heirs to one of the richest oil fortunes in Texas. Through shrewd investment, the brothers were well on their way to becoming one of the wealthiest families in the country. While capitalist older brother Sid managed the family finances, Ed, the second brother, wore a ponytail and told friends he craved a simpler, fulfilling life. Ed had grown up with a love of nature. As a boy, he had enjoyed fishing trips with his father, weekends riding on the family's cattle ranches, and vacations on a small coastal island owned by his uncle, oil tycoon Sid Richardson. After dropping out of graduate school at Yale, Ed set out to start fresh in New Mexico and began building his own house in the mountains outside Albuquerque. But the project stayed half finished, out of compliance with building codes, and the state was threatening to tear it down. By chance, Ed attended a theater performance at Synergia Ranch. Around the same time, he also got to know Phil Hawes, the Synergia Earth architect, through a mutual friend. Soon after, Ed hired the ranch's construction crew to finish his house. This is funny. The relationship was further cemented in 1974 when he entered his own construction company, Badlands Conspiracy Co., into a joint venture with Sinopco to finance the Adobe condominium complex in Santa Fe. Shortly after, Ed finally moved to Synergia Ranch. When not working on building projects, he learned to act and toured with the theater company. Though naturally shy, he enjoyed being on stage. On the Theater of All Possibilities African tour, he played a farcical capitalist character who ate bureaucratic red tape, and the Nigerians loved him. It was the quiet beginning of a business relationship that would grow to span 2 decades and hundreds of millions of dollars. So yeah, they bag a big fish here. Reid, what can you tell us about Ed Bass, the oil tycoon, like semi-failson? I guess we'll see how much of a failson.
The question is, to what extent is he actually a failson? And
right. Is it a front? Is the ponytail a front? What can you tell us about him?
So, as you mentioned, he did seem to genuinely, bounce from gig to gig. He wasn't really sure what he wanted to do with his life, but he did have a strong, again, quote unquote, countercultural streak. So by the time, and again, he comes, as you said, from an extremely, at that time, wealthy oil family. The Bass brothers have, at this point, I don't know if his older brothers are still alive, but Ed Bass himself is, increased their wealth many times over through investments and other projects with other major oil corporations. So they're extremely wealthy now. They were very wealthy back then, especially regionally in Texas and in New Mexico. So when Ed Bass links up with the Synergia Ranch crowd, he very quickly falls just totally under the Svengali-like sway of Allen and is basically the chief bankroller, replacing Marie Harding, who provided the initial capital investment to buy the ranch itself, and is basically the reason that the Theater of All Possibilities, later the Caravan of Dreams, was able to operate despite the extremely poor reception of their acting quality and their self-written plays. So he continues to be their financial lifeline, as well as their link to other investors and eventually the Biosphere 2 project, because he provides the money, he provides the establishment credibility. Like mentioned, he'd been, Yale graduate student, comes from this extremely wealthy, powerful family, and provides them a greater in, even though they're already members of the ranch are already relatively well connected. Allen himself is connected. Marie Harding is very well connected. Bass sort of takes it to the next level. And maybe skipping ahead a little bit, the degree to which this is just Bass coming in to sort of, seek enlightenment or find his way in the world or assuage some of his guilt versus being in on the real purpose of the cult is a little bit hard to discern, because he is one of the abuse victims. He doesn't come out and say this himself, but there's other people who testify to the fact that Allen would beat him. There's one Dallas Morning News story where Ed Bass was portrayed as being on his hands and knees, denouncing his brothers and himself as capitalists, even though that's not something that Allen is actually opposed to. He's very much pro-business. But
Right. It's not about that. It's about submission to him and making these little wasps feel so bad.
exactly.
He's so good at it.
Exactly. And I mean, just like to the level of just straight up physical abuse. It was reported that in the Fort Worth Star Telegram, that in the acting classes, which were run by Marie, that Alan verbally and physically abused Bass. There was screaming punctuated with kicks and slaps. Alan, of course, says that the beating accounts are fabrication, and that he had never struck Bass, but only yelled at him when he was, quote, this quote from Alan, when he was acting like a snotty Yale millionaire, a kind of person, of course, which we know Alan was not opposed to hanging around with. He loved that kind of person.
Yeah, he relied on those types of people, of course. Yeah. But no, it's really fascinating. I mean, obvious, like there's a number of parallels that you could make. The biggest one for me is probably like the Bronfman sisters and Nexium. I got a lot of like similar vibes with that, where I mean, they just think like this guy's a visionary, he's a genius, and like who knows in that situation if they were either like complicit in his, complicit in his abuse of others, probably, or maybe were also like abused by him. I'm sure at least psychologically manipulated by him to some extent, themselves. But it is a thing that can happen. I mean, when you get these rich people that are kind of aimless and you throw them in like an Esalen Institute type environment or a Synergia Ranch, and you get this like guru to kind of like drill into them. And if they get their claws into them, well then, it's a very profitable payday for the group. And I mean, Bass was like for I guess, yeah, like over 20 years, like his life was deeply intertwined with Alan and the Synergia Ranch kind of crew, culminating, you could say, like in Biosphere 2. That was kind of like, yeah, the apogee of the Bass Allen collab.
Yeah. And it certainly did draw attention from sort of the establishment in the high society crowd that Bass was in, seeing his activities with the Synergia Ranch cult. So, in particular, his role in financing and acting in the Caravan of Dreams, formerly the Theater of All Possibilities, that at the time, this is in the 70s and then going into the 80s as well, suspicions about the goings-on at the Caravan of Dreams grew. But every time they would leave the building, people on the street would turn their heads and stare, remarked one Fort Worth resident who frequented the caravan. Some serious theater goers felt insulted by the original dramas that they put on, like Kabuki Blues, a parable
Kabuki Blues.
A group of actors and dancers forced to abandon New York by the evil moneymakers of Western civilization. They flee to Australia, where they make a deal with super techs who provide them with a spaceship. They then travel to Mars, where they peer through a telescope and watch a nuclear holocaust consume the Earth. So again, very much kind of about their own community. Yeah. And that fear of nuclear war is something that we see in Lawrence Vesey's account, where the group shares their anxieties about the inevitability of nuclear war. Alan himself has a weird anecdote where he's kind of bragging about how he fled the country, the United States, to a quote neutral country during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So it's like that's very, that's again like an Ira Einhorn style thing of, well, you really should stop talking if your lawyer were to advise you, but please more about that. That's really strange.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll just add here, just because I mentioned the nuclear war stuff, that's something that's a big through line for Alan's own worldview. He sort of talks about nuclear war as being inevitable. And Khalid, as you were talking about sort of in the introduction, the question of, well, is this really about space colonization, or is it about making livable bunkers for the super rich pending some earthly disaster, seems very much to be something present in Alan's mind as well. As he put it one time, he said that he believed the only way for mankind to achieve cosmic immortality is for humans to create biospheres as, quote, space seeds, and to colonize planets like Mars. So very much sort of talking out of both sides of his mouth.
Yeah, there's this insane, like, from like on page 390 of the communal experience, like I flagged this all as like just absolute like madness. Like there's so much like here in this, like this is during his like sort of extended portrait of John Allen himself. He says the signposts leading into Ezra, that is John's mind, are many, and some of them appear to conflict. One of the plainest, continually reappearing in his conversations, is a frank elitism. The mass of men, he says freely, have a herd mind. There are three kinds of people historically. Those who operate on worldly knowledge alone, the masses, those who follow rules, whether in a religious movement or in communism, and who can be called fanatics. And thirdly, the tiny minority who compose an elite culture geared to an intensive self-development. The elite does not impose rules on anybody else, but it consists of people who transcend the ordinary regulations freely in order to experiment with what is truly applicable to their own needs. One can't be eligible immediately for the elite culture. First, one must go through the rule-following phase, whether in scientific or religious terms. His own community, he clearly believes, is engaged in forming an elite, meanwhile masking itself, for instance, as a quote-unquote theater group, for self-protective purposes. All new civilizations, Ezra says in a mood that connects with Spengler as well as with Bennett, are consciously created by a leader and a small group who surround him in a quote-unquote school. Cultural change is always of this kind, he believes. Even tribal societies evolve from small groups clustered around their magicians. Athens and England, his favorite examples, were governed by small minorities. He talks a lot about his like obsession with Athens and England, which I also have to say is like, again, that is a theater thing, like to the max, because like obviously England, that's associated with Shakespeare, and Athens is classical Greek drama. Like that's definitely like what he's thinking of, like esoteric, like John Dee type of shit, and Shakespeare. And then like, Aeschylus and, in addition to like people like Plato and all like, the Greek philosophers as well as the dramatists. And that's kind of reflected in their catalog. And this is like, obviously, like, I think that this quote really speaks to it. Like, it's an elite that's masking itself as a theater group, so this is involving disguise, but, also, like, of course, there's like layers and layers of disguise, which I think is kind of, it's important in terms of like thinking about that type of like tendency in general. And when like you see these kind of like themes of like theatricality and masquerade like being elements of these groups, like in general, like it's important to bear in mind like how deeply the genealogy of like the theater in the Western world is like tied up with them. But he goes on to talk about how, his obsession with Harvard and Oxford, and how he kind of, even though he's constantly berating people for being snobs, he also kind of has a reverence for those institutions, and he reserves like his real contempt for like the University of California, which has wrongly attempted a mass education that can never possibly succeed. The older private institutions, in his view, have retained a realistically low view of human nature. They are doing valuable work and should at all costs keep their independence from other forces in society. And of course he's married to Marie, but he kind of bullies her about being a snob, but he also obviously it's a source of pride for him. And then he like kind of goes through some of his really crazy beliefs that he has here, like less emotional in tone, yet no less strongly argued is his conviction that the whole course of Western civilization, at least since the Reformation, has been fundamentally wrong, and that he has personally seceded from Western culture. He applies this point of view to everything from music to mathematics. Conventional music, he argues, drugs the mind, reducing one's degree of awareness. Thus, in his own thinking, the community he has created is entirely non-Western, despite the fact that its visible face is so largely scientific and even technological. Science indeed poses a difficulty for him. In one breath, he will appear to attack the Western scientific tradition for its narrowness and externalism. In the next, he will seem to embrace it, defining it as an elite occupation which the Western masses themselves have never truly comprehended. One evening, he seriously claimed that American culture was hostile to science and to the habit of precise measurement. He keeps talking about JD Bennett and stuff. There's this
there's a couple name drops I want to read here that jumped out at me when it says on more concrete matters of history and politics, which he does still talk about from time to time. Ezra reveals a greater degree of seeming idiosyncrasy, though no less fervency of conviction. Many of his statements in this realm have an arbitrary, disconnected quality. Thus, he once volunteered a curious list of organizations which, like his own group, are helping to create the new culture. And this is a real doozy of a list. Esalen, the Institute for Advanced Study, the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory, and the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. Another day, however, he sharply distinguished Esalen from his own community, claiming that it was seeking through pretentious means to adjust people to their present lives, like all psychoanalysis. Again, he will suddenly say that he thinks J. Edgar Hoover and Ronald Reagan have, quote, a point, to use his phrase, about the danger of communist infiltration in the New Left. There is a definite anti-communist undertone in his thinking, though he is respectably anti-fascist as well. Quote, the gutter elite, the fascisti, would close us down immediately if they ever came to power in America, he said to me. And he made the comparison with Socrates' fate in Athens. But in another context, he claimed that Franklin Roosevelt had really surrendered to all the large corporations just before the outbreak of the Second World War. Altogether, I had the distinct impression, despite Ezra's apocalyptic vision of the rottenness and doom of the old culture, that the wisps of concrete political conviction, which he had carried over into this phase of his life, were moderately conservative in many instances, more congenial to a straight than to a hip view of what was going on. The white-controlled nations of the British Commonwealth figure strongly in his planetary vision of the future, and with no seeming awareness of the reactionary racial implications in this perspective. A man with a partly Southern background, Ezra says nothing that would reveal so much as a casual sympathy for the civil rights movement. No blacks are in his group, and their absence never seems to be commented upon. It is clear from many angles that his is not a left-wing group by any definition. Yet it would not be at all fair to call it a right-wing group either. At bottom, it is truly non-political. Cue the Grateful Dead fucking music playing. Ezra explicitly pictures us as living in Rome around 0 AD, beginning an underground work which may not bear widely visible fruit for several centuries. Beside this conception of one's place in history, ordinary political implications rapidly fade. Wow. Kind of like an interesting grab bag there. The CSDI, home of Raghavan Iyer, Aquino's mentor, and sponsored by the Ford Foundation. He thinks they're legit. So, very radical, interesting.
One thing I noticed about his description of, or Vasey's description of the Synergia compound was that no one ever said the words God or which, as we know, is like very very sus to never say or to say
we would never on this podcast.
I mean, it feeds into this kind of thing of like, again, it's all like very performative. Like this kind of it reminds me of that Alan Watts type of thing of like that, where he has this little passage here where like, what is life? He asked rhetorically one night during a session preparing for the ecology conference. Only briefly did he pretend to let the group fumble for an answer before he announced triumphantly, "The cell is life." It's like,
Ooh,
all right,
epic.
like, you just like really confidently say something.
Yeah.
And like people will like, well, he obviously like feels passionately about this, so he must be correct. Like, another detail I liked is that he would use the word loving in a sneering and contemptuous way, just as he also uses the word democracy.
Wow. Amazing. Yeah. So, I mean, I think what we see in all of this, like his conception of like the elite is, we haven't really gotten into it yet, but this Gurdjieffian influence that Vasey like clocks very hard. And he's like, oh, this guy's a fucking Gurdjieffian. Like, and it's sort of like not advertised on the pamphlets, though I think it might be on his reading list.
Yeah,
or there's
weird. Like according to him,
Uspensky is on it, right?
It seems like it's impossible to get away from like Gurdjieff in this group. Like he even says, like in one sense, like our group started like 4,000 years ago or something, or 40,000. Like there's that weird quote where he's like, in one sense, it started like 40,000 years ago, right? Like and in another sense, it started like basically like when Gurdjieff began, his his writings. Right. In another sense, it started like in the actual year that like he built the compound.
Yeah, and in France in the 1920s. Yeah. Yeah. Where he also like freaked out.
40,000 years ago. Yeah. And another began in 1912, and still another it began in 1966. Yeah. So 1912 being the year like Gurdjieff started actively teaching. So yeah, it seemed like it was impossible to get away from Gurdjieff, but it was weird because like he apparently started studying Gurdjieff like when he was 18, right? Like really young. So before almost like, a lot of
before
his life.
Harvard.
So something that had been with him forever. Yeah.
Yeah. There's an interesting part here about like the role of these kind of like movements throughout American history and like the Gurdjieffian influence. I think on 398, The Old and the New. He says Gurdjieff defined man as a cosmic apparatus for the transformation of energy. Fascination with energy sources is no mere product of the present modish concern for ecological harmonies. Belief in using the will to increase one's personal store of energy lies at the very core of what has been called the mind cure tradition in American popular thought. It is a tradition which goes back for at least a century, and as such figures as Gurdjieff, Nichol, and Bennett remind us, it is really an international tradition. Somewhat similar quests for, quote, self-development along these lines were occurring both in Moscow and Los Angeles around the year 1915. In a milder, non-authoritarian way, the New Thought movement paralleled the early Gurdjieff groups in seeking to tap the ever normal reservoirs of cosmic strength. Through all such groups, whether broadly democratic or esoterically elitist, runs the following theme: that unenlightened man is weak, quote, asleep, drained of vitality, that men, or some advanced men and women, can willfully transform themselves into powerful, dynamic, and yes, successful individuals able to manipulate their surroundings because they learn to unlock the cosmic reservoir and bathe themselves in its infinite vitality. Later in the 1930s, such derivative but extreme movements, such as the I Am and Mankind United, dwelt even more nakedly upon energy, power, and manipulation as their obsessive central concerns. On this level, the aim of the contemporary group in New Mexico is indeed hoary with age. In one sense, it links directly with the positive thinking tradition popularized by Norman Vincent Peale. Quote, "You're being negative" is a favorite term of reproach on the New Mexico ranch. No. The existence of exercises to promote mental concentration, relaxation, and subjugation of the body to the mind's will further reveals such a tie. Yeah, and he goes on to like attack Freudianism and also like rejecting kind of LSD. I think in another section, Vasey brings up the I Am comparatively a few times to this. And also, I think one time he brings up Technocracy Incorporated. And that's another interesting, weird little connection. I don't know if you could like really trace like, I don't know, the individuals or something that are connected, but Technocracy Incorporated was that group that was like kind of like techno-utopianist in the 1930s. And most of what I know about them is because Elon Musk's grandfather, who was living in Canada, was like a major figure in one of the chapters of Technocracy Incorporated in the 30s. And when the Nazis attacked the USSR in 1941, the technocracy group decided to like side with the Allies and like with the Soviet Union. And Elon's grandfather was so disgusted by this and so outraged that I guess this organization that he thought was maybe fascist, I don't know, wasn't fascist enough. So he moved his family to South Africa, apartheid South Africa, which is why like then I think his daughter married Elon's father, and then that's why Elon is from South Africa. But again, interesting that like his grandfather was a big figure in like a similar vibe kind of group in the 1930s. I don't know if they were talking about Mars colonies back then, but they were the type that could have been. Then this group is like obsessed with like the going to Mars, blah, blah, blah. And then like Elon is fucking obsessed with like also kind of like, especially after buying X, like kind of obsessed with like manipulating people and like control and shit like that, like controlling the discourse and blah, blah, blah. In this like, I mean, he seems dumb, but like who knows what kind of neo-Gurdjieffian nonsense he's been fed by his drug dealer. You know what I mean? So I don't know, just interesting like interesting parallels going on. But there's a deep tradition of this kind of stuff in American history. So yeah, New Thought, Gurdjieff, I Am, blah blah blah. So maybe I think now maybe it's a good time to like we talked about Bass, we talked about them going around doing sus theater. They're basically a cult. They're obsessed with Gurdjieff and like being like a weird shadow elite that is going to like lead the world out of darkness. Blah blah blah. Kind of a weird mix of Cowboy Manifest Destiny. This is also like a huge thing that jumped out reading this was like, they even mentioned in their cover up documentary, Stuart Brand, of course, like the picture. They all have to say it.
Yeah.
The picture. I saw the Whole Earth catalog cover of the picture.
Yeah, that was a big influence on them, according to that. Yeah, right.
I want to prove the moon landing is fake so bad, just to like make these people like shut the fuck up about it. Like, you know what I mean? Like
that's
like,
that's a hilarious form of negative polarization.
I know,
like,
I'm being very negative right now.
Catalog so much
that
I need to disprove that. I mean, I guess you just become a flat earther by that logic. Like that would really
no, but I could believe it's round and believe we didn't go there. That's more sensible.
Well, I just mean like what would really destroy the whole Earth that would really own the
whole Earth. I mean, who knows? But no, they all loved it, and of course, like it has that John Perry Barlow, Stuart Brand kind of thing about like the new frontiers, like in our ways of being and our mind, man. Like, but like it's just assumed that we have to keep expanding and colonizing. You know what I mean? Like that impulse, that frontier impulse is there. And many of these members have it in
It is
various
funny
ways.
the idea that oh, if we all see the Earth from outside, then we'll all like care more about the Earth and we'll realize how fragile the Earth is. Like that's like the kind of like a big contradiction at the core of Biosphere 2. Like on one hand, like, oh, this will show us that like everything we do can impact our biosphere and like how fragile this biosphere is. But on the other hand, this is like a model for how we're gonna like actually leave the Earth and go to space because like the apocalypse is inevitable and like the Earth will soon be destroyed. Like,
Yeah, those two
and there's
things are
nothing we can actually
bumping up
do
against
about
each
it.
other very, it's like a hot and cold kind of thing. It's interesting. Yeah, so I don't know. Like they start having conferences in the early 80s where they invite like, really CSDI vibes where they start inviting, eminent people. Like Richard Dawkins was at one of these planetary conferences. Or there was Planet Earth Conference, Solar System Conference, Galactic Conference, and then
That must have been
Cosmos
pretty early in
Conference.
his career. Was that like
Right.
back when he was doing like what? Yeah,
Mimetic,
like when
whatever.
was
Yeah.
that? Yeah,
This is I mean he's listed here as a biologist, Richard Dawkins, Lynn
I see.
Margulis, Buckminster Fuller, astronaut Rusty Schweikart, jazz musician Ornette Coleman, and also there's one funny example here. I think in 1980 there were a bunch of anthropologists there talking about the history of humankind. Various scientists lectured on the world's plants, oceans, geology, climate, and diseases, and beat novelist William S. Burroughs delivered a rambling lecture on his personal vision of, quote, the four horsemen of the apocalypse,
Oh yeah,
concluding
he
that
loved William S.
humans,
Burroughs too.
yeah,
Right? Yeah.
concluding that humans should transcend the beleaguered Earth and evolve to voyage space in an, quote, astral dream body, sending some of the more orthodox scientists into fits, while John Allen and Ed Bass respectfully asked questions of their counterculture hero. So they're just like
Yeah.
they love fucking Wilmus Burrow, another red flag. They just think this guy, another like silk topper, by the way, like just an heir to a computer fortune who like shot his wife in the head and did heroin. So therefore he's like profound. Yeah, they love this guy. I think Tim Leary would later, with Burroughs, they would visit the Biosphere 2 together, I think like before the experiment started. And you just know that Tim Leary thought it was the grooviest shit ever. He just loved it. Like, probably went on some rant about how it was neotenous and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So through the 80s, they're like getting a little more clout in like kind of the fringes of like academic and also like countercultural and like environmentalist kind of scenes, I guess. I guess we're kind of like we're about here. So maybe we should talk about from this period, like from the 80s, like Reid, how does Biosphere 2, in your estimation, like come about? Because this is when it does, right?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think the first place to start is just unpacking the conferences that you were talking about a little bit more. So making the parallel between that and things like the Edge network, right? Epstein's
Right.
speaker and dinner circuit that connected
Santa Fe Institute.
Santa Fe Institute, right? For like complexity science, all that stuff. But bringing actual, credentialed, successful scientists into connection with financiers, people who are involved in public policy, people like Ed Bass, the kind of avant-garde theater scene. It's very much a way of, like you said, building that social clout, but also creating buzz and doing like credential laundering. So I forget the year that it's founded, but the Institute for Ecotechnics, which is still around today, is basically the chief vehicle for organizing all of these events. They kind of coordinate the different compounds that Allen's various companies own around the world, including Synergia Ranch and formerly Biosphere 2. So they were promoting these ideas that a lot of other groups were promoting and discussing about whole systems science. That's one of the phrases that they were really big fans of. And in particular, that idea of space colonization. So there's one article from the early 90s where this is right around when Biosphere is really starting to ramp up, but it documents how one of Allen's angles was trying to get in with NASA as a consultant. So part of the origin for the Biosphere 2 project in general was the idea of using it as a springboard for greater connections within the actual the high level like scientific administration of the United States and securing contracts as well as other relationships with research scientists and funding institutions. The origin for Biosphere 2 itself, as far as I can remember, one second, because it was originally done as a joint venture with the University of Arizona's ecology laboratory.
Right. And they had sort of had like protean ideas about like a biosphere since I think like the early 70s. They had sort of talked vaguely about it. And then they
Yeah,
did
I
go
mean,
and
there's
set up encampments in every biome in the world. Like they set up a different little like Synergia Ranch outpost so that they could like collect data and stuff, right?
Yeah, like I mean, you were just talking about Gurdjieff, but like if you really want, I feel like the real thing that like unites like all of like their like ideas like intellectually is this book, The Dramatic Universe by John G. Bennett, who I mentioned, it came up a little bit before. Like if you look at that, it has everything that like they would eventually like the biosphere, like the planetary consciousness, like the theater element. Like it's all basically about like the cosmic drama of the universe, like the connection between plants and animals. Obviously, there's stuff like the naturalist trance that's also like an influence, you know, and like they're engaged with the whole soup of ideas. But if you read that book, like the biosphere comes up in that like constantly, you know, yeah, and you can even see like like biosphere is like even in Vasey's book, like it's like written on some board in their Synergia compound. So like it's something that they were obsessed with for a while, probably emerging from some of these like Gurdjieff adjacent books.
It's something that was coming out of the AEC itself as well. So a lot of early ecosystems research was done and financed directly by the Atomic Energy Commission. So I'm sure it's no accident that
His
Alan
old boss.
Alan being in with Lillianthal was probably, especially in the 50s when some of this stuff was really sort of getting its start, looking at the effect that radiation has on different ecosystems, trying to measure them as like they wouldn't have used this term, but like that total system sort of measurement comes out of some AEC research from the 50s and the 60s. So it may have been stuff that Alan was exposed to directly, or it was just things that he was picking up from what scientific literature he was looking at. I got to take a quick break, then we can get back into it.
Yeah.
Ecological thing, what are you going to bring to girls and boys?
Ecological thing, what are you going to bring to girls and boys who have a choice to ring from?
The world of matter.
We don't want matriarchy, human sacrifice. We don't want patriarchy, too much good advice. We want to roll the dice. We want to roll the dice.
Across the forest floor.
We want to roll the dice.
Where the deep waters roll.
We want to roll the dice.
Where the sandhills flow.
We want to roll the dice until they come up nice. Flowers everywhere with sound of these whales and wolves with smiling teeth and puffed heads.
Yeah, turning from oily, hot licked potatoes and pounding brain.
Ecological dome, when will you promise kingdom come for girls and boys who have a choice to be done with?
Created disaster.
I need to lead everyone today. I need to lead everyone today. I need to lead everyone today.
Don't want glory and renown in war, they pay too high a price. We don't want goods galore at an ever-rising price.
Neckties and glitzy socks and carloads of suburban jocks.
We want the cool street, and we want to roll the
In
dice.
meadows where we dream.
We want to roll the dice.
Towns where streets are
We
clean.
want to roll the dice until they come up nice. Flowers everywhere with sound of these whales and wolves with Ecological sphere, you've got nothing to fear from girls and boys who make the choice to see clear.
To the heart of the matter.
You don't want to smog in the crystal ball, it's not enticing. Who want the future in their eyes to be inviting. Who want to roll the dice.
Of the land of the swords of war.
Who want to roll the dice.
Love the word that breathes.
Who want to roll the dice.
The sight sound of birds and trees.
Who want to roll the dice. Until they count up the nights. Flowers everywhere, sound of these waves, and wolves with smiling teeth and puppets. Yeah. Flowers everywhere, sound of these waves, and wolves with smiling teeth and puppets.
Yeah, even me too come out from the laboratory laden, sunlight and starlight, all of the dreams come true.